Hi, this is Leonie at IndieDevKit.com. Thank you for watching. One of the topics included on our website, and the one we're talking about today, is how to present your game. Or in other words, how do you figure out what to communicate? This is important because once you figure out exactly what you need to communicate, pitching and promoting your game will be easier and more effective. But figuring out how to present your game is tough, especially when you're doing it for the first time. It's hard not to be biased. It's hard to prioritize features. And you may not even see some of the things that are cool about your own game. There's all kinds of different ways to figure out what to communicate. We call this process messaging your game, and this talk is an outline of how we do it. We'll start with trying to define it. Then we'll step through the process we call messaging, and we briefly show you how messaging is brought to life, as well as share some tips on how to keep it alive. When I was preparing this talk, I realized I've never actually defined the term messaging before, so I decided to look it up. But when I Googled to see if there's a definition that allows me to explain it to you, the internet kind of came up empty. Sure, a meta description like this one from dictionary.com is accurate, a system or a process of transmitting messages, but it's not very specific. So here's my best attempt at a definition of messaging. The process of describing and ranking all relevant aspects of your game, declaring what sets you apart from other games in a concise and communicable manner. Now there's a couple of things in this definition that are important to highlight. The first one is that messaging is always user-facing. It's not about you and what you're trying to say, it's about what your audience perceives. That's a very important part of it, and we'll get back to this later. Messaging is descriptive by definition, which also means it has to be true. There's no point in pushing something that is not there, because A, it gives people a reason to argue, taking oxygen away from more important things, and B, it misses the communicable mark. You can't show or communicate something that is not there. This part especially can be very humbling, because sometimes we really have something in our heads that we want to see reflected in the game, but it's simply not coming across to the audience. Going back to the first point, if they don't see it, it does not exist. Thirdly, messaging is the sum of its parts. It's like cake. If messaging is your cake, then each ingredient is a message. It's also important to note that each message is a sequence of events. When people look at your page, your video, your tweet, or just about anything, they go through 4 different stages very rapidly. First, you need to grab their attention, get them interested, create a desire, and convert that desire into action. Think about an online article. Something like a headline grabs their attention. So they take a look, maybe they read the excerpt. And they're interested to learn more, so they click to watch the video. They like what they see and they now have a desire to play the game. So when presented with the opportunity, they take action. You need to be aware of and recreate this sequence every single time. So, that's what we think messaging is. The process of describing and ranking all relevant to your audience aspects of your game, declaring what sets you apart from other games in a concise and communicable manner. Once you have articulated your messaging, you still need to find how, where, and when to communicate these messages. We'll touch on that briefly at the end of the presentation. Now that we've defined the process, let's get real about how to do this. I'll take you through our 5-step messaging process using 2 different examples from 2 different games who recently went through the very same exercise. These examples are here because I think they will help illustrate the process. They are not meant to be taken literally, and there's no need to read every word. But hopefully they'll help you get a grasp on each of the 5 steps in this process. First, you sit down and list any word you can think of that might capture an aspect of the game. These words can be anything, from general emotions, such as creepy, mysterious, or happy, to concepts like interactive story or a roguelite, to things as specific as game engine, combat design elements, or characters. Just list anything that comes to mind in one quick 15-minute session. Once this is done, spend some time doing something completely different. Then come back and see if there's anything you may have missed in a 5-minute recap. After this, anything you still haven't listed is probably not that important. This is an example from the Submerge team at Uppercut Studios in Australia. No need to read all of this, we're just using these examples to illustrate the process. This is a game with a strong focus on narrative and environment, and you see that reflected in the number of words as well as the type of words, such as redemption, decay, or family. By contrast, here is an example of a more systemic-driven game, Turmoil by Gamius in Amsterdam. You'll see words like procedural or time-based, and you'll also see fewer words because they are a lighter game, both in terms of narrative and scope. The next step is to categorize these words. Usually you look at the word cloud and you find these words coalesce naturally into groups. You can create clusters such as gameplay, environment, story, combat, and sort words by dragging and dropping them into each one of these categories. These categories are different for each game, and in this step, you determine which ones are the main categories for your game. I'd recommend up to 5 groups. If you would have more, the resulting messaging becomes unwieldy, so you need to focus down until you have 5 groups or less. There can be overlap between groups, like you see here, and that's fine. If a word fits into more than one category, simply place it in the most obvious column, or have your categories overlap. The words are always going to end up where they matter the most in the next steps, so don't sweat it too much. If there's a lot of overlap for some words, that might be an indication that those words are very important, but not necessarily. We'll talk about how to determine that later. Here's what the categories look like for Turmoil. You'll see that their categories are different. They've added levels and simulation, and they don't have story and environment. For other games, you might see the gameplay categories split into subcategories. It really just depends on your game and what makes sense. You'll probably know it when you see it in the word cloud. Our third step is to summarize each category into a small blurb of text that describes what bonds these words together. Again, no need to read or memorize any of this. It's the method and process that matters, not the exact words of our examples. You summarize each category into a cohesive story, a declarative statement, if you will. You may find that as you write these, you need to add words you'd not added previously in the word cloud. This is not a problem. Just remember, this exercise is a process to coax out what you have in your head, not to poke holes in any one step of the process. Don't worry about length and detail in this step. Just get everything down on paper. Now we drop these declarative statements onto one page and start editorializing, making them easier to read, getting rid of any overlap there might be. Look for repetition. Look at how you can combine things to describe multiple aspects of the game. With this kind of short-form writing, you need to take breaks if you start to get frustrated or keep altering things and changing them back. Just keep wordsmithing this page until you feel like the remaining text is concise, captures the essence of the summaries in step 3, and is also a good read. If you want, you can bullet point features further down on the page and explain them in more detail. You might want to come back to this with fresh eyes after a day or two as well. But at the end of this step, you now have one page that describes your game. You don't always have time and space to print a full page of text, nor does your audience have time to sit down and read it. So it's very useful to be able to explain your game and get people's attention with one sentence. The first part of your sequence, if you remember from a few slides back. But how do you prioritize your messaging points? There's probably a million different ways to go about it, and big companies might hire a research firm to test each messaging point. But assuming that most of us don't have this luxury, here's a little exercise to hold on to. Make 2 lists for your messaging points, the points of difference and the points of parity. You'll compare your game against all the other ones in a category and start listing your messaging points on either left or right list. How do you differ from the pack, and what elements are the same? Taking Submerged as an example, comparing them to other narrative-driven adventure games, it stands out that there is no combat, and there is player-driven pacing. They also have vast open outdoor environments. Some points of parity compared to most games like this are that the player needs to decipher the story, or the fact that the game has been made using the Unreal Engine. You keep listing all the messaging points that you think might be relevant to your audience. After you're done, you start labeling them. Are they relevant or important to your audience? Are they unexpected or surprising to your audience? Are they unique and different compared to your competition? Superior compared to your competition? Are they credible for you to be communicating? Are they easy to communicate? And lastly, are they feasible and sustainable, meaning something that's not likely to be cut from the game? In your one sentence, you're trying to identify the one thing about your game that is all of these things. But if you don't have a feature that hits on all of these, just try to find the one that hits on most of these and lead with that. Going back to our example, Combat Free is very relevant to an audience that wants to enjoy the story and environment without the pressure of combat and player death. It's also very credible for these guys to be communicating this. They left AAA development to experiment what the opposite of a combat-driven game would look like. Player-driven pacing is again relevant to this audience who does not like to feel rushed. This feature is so core to the game's design that it's unlikely to be cut, making it very feasible. The vast, open environment is a very strong feature. It is relevant. People like getting some value for money. It's a large game compared to most in the category, making it superior, and it's very easy to communicate visually. Looking at the points of parity, deciphering a story is something that many games in this category do, but it's very relevant to the audience because that's what they like doing. It is credible coming from developers who previously worked on BioShock games, and it's easy to communicate, unlikely to be cut. The message about the engine is credible enough and easy to communicate, also very unlikely to change, making it very feasible. You keep going like this until you feel like you've listed all of your messaging points, your cake ingredients, if you will. In your one sentence, you're trying to identify those things about your game that hit on most of these labels and lead with that. Typically, you want to assign some more weight to an item if it's in the points of difference column. But sometimes there can be things in the points of parity column that are so important to your audience that you should list them. A strong indicator that an item can move to the background is when you haven't assigned it with a relevant label. So the end result of that exercise for both our example games is listed here, from word cloud to one sentence. You'll also notice a little bit of player purpose worded in. Submerged is a combat-free game in which you explore a mysterious flooded city at your own pace, gradually piecing together the story of a broken family and a broken world. Turmoil offers players a visually charming, tongue-in-cheek take on the simulation genre inspired by the 19th century oil rush in North America. Besides a one sentence, I always like having a one paragraph available as well for all those in-between situations where people ask you for a game description. Here you can be a little bit more generous with words and provide some extra color as well. So let's take a look at how this process has influenced the text for Submerged. This is the original description the team had drafted before going through the process, and this is the paragraph we just ended up with. So let's go a little bit CSI here. The first thing I read is your brother is dying. This information was very important to the team because they wanted to establish that story, that relationship, and it's the player's core purpose. But remember the definition of the messaging process. It's not about you, it's about your audience. As a first-time reader, I don't know who my brother is. I don't even know who I am yet, so why would I care? Although it's an important element that certainly deserves a place in the messaging, it is not the first thing anyone should read. Other elements worth highlighting are the flooded streets. It's an exploration game at its core, and the player needs to find objects to reveal pieces of the story. In the new text, we still explore the submerged city. The wounded brother comes back here, and you need to discover hidden objects to piece together the story. So far, so good. But there were some important parts of the game missing in the original description. By prioritizing features, those boiled to the surface and found a place in the new description, such as the fact that this is a combat-free game, the fact that there are vast outdoor environments, a better, more active sense of what the player is doing, or the fact that the game's pace is 100% determined by the player. These are just some examples that hopefully get you thinking about the process of messaging and how it applies to your own game. To recap the process, Step 1, build a word cloud. Step 2, create categories for the words. Step 3, summarize each category. Step 4, editorialize everything. And Step 5, prioritize. After creating your messaging, you still need to bring it to life, or it can fall flat. But bringing it to life is still kind of a vague advice. By bringing it to life, I mean that you need to create a long sequence of touch points that all combine to make your marketing campaign. A touch point is a combination of 5 things: your message, the what, the form in which you convey your message, the how, the audience that your message is intended for, the who, the best place to communicate your message, where, and lastly, the timing. When is the best time to be communicating? Your campaign is basically an endless stream of touch points. An interview is a touch point. A tweet is a touch point. Your website is a touch point, and so on. Another example of a touch point is a video. Looking at the launch trailer for Submerged, there were some key messages that needed to be communicated. This is all the what. The video itself is the how. The when, where, and who questions were answered in collaboration with first-party and media partners, allowing Uppercut to get better exposure for the video. Let's take a look. Now here's a little backstory to illustrate how you can apply the results from your messaging process over and over again. 20% of the viewers do not watch more than 10 seconds of a video on YouTube. A third doesn't watch more than 30 seconds. So you need to prioritize. An older version of this video that was done before going through the process had the video opening with various logos. The video didn't actually start until 10 seconds in. Because the team now knows to prioritize their vast open environments over the logos got pushed back to the end. Here's a video touchpoint for Turmoil. In this video, they needed to introduce the game while showing off their art and tongue-in-cheek nature. They were about to launch an early access campaign which influenced the who, where, and when. So those are touch points. There are going to be many, many touch points throughout your campaign, and that's how you bring your messaging to life. Now you know how to create your messaging, and we talked about bringing it to life. I also wanted to share 3 tips to help you keep your messaging alive. Using quality assets sounds obvious, but I still see spelling mistakes or low-resolution images. Sometimes ads that don't even mention that they're advertising a game. Marketing campaigns can have complex pipelines, and it can get crazy busy, allowing for mistakes to happen. So do what you can to mitigate the risk and put a process in place. A spelling mistake is a small error in the scheme of things, but it reflects badly on your product, and it doesn't give people that assurance of quality. So first, make sure that you have final approval over every single asset that goes out, or designate someone else to do it. The bigger the campaign, the harder but more important this is. Make sure that you agree on this up front if you have a publisher. Once you have control, make sure you use your power wisely. Have a checklist and know what you're looking for. Secondly, always make sure that your assets communicate the right things based on your messaging. Determine what always needs to be shown as your constants and what variables to add for that specific asset. Because you're too close to it, you should always get feedback on important assets to make sure that people understand the message. There are research firms who specialize in this, but if you can't afford them, just test them amongst people in your environment. Lastly, if you have access to a QA team, give them a heads up as soon as you know an important asset is coming down the pipeline and ask them to QA it. For instance, websites in different browsers or videos in different players and audio settings. Sometimes you might want to get a freelance copy editor to weed out spelling and grammar mistakes. In short, do whatever you can to check yourself. Research proves messages are more effective when repeated. In advertising, the term effective frequency is used to describe the number of times someone must be exposed to a message before you get the desired response. Marketing experts like to debate the right number for effective frequency. Some say repeating a message 3 times will work. Others believe the rule of 7 applies. A study from Microsoft recently concluded that the optimal number for audio messages is between 6 and 20. The point being that research has proven time and time again that messages are best remembered, believed, and deemed to be popular when repeated. Messages are more effective when repeated. Just think of these ones that you probably have heard plenty of times. You never know exactly who has seen your message how many times, so you have to keep going the best you can. Stick to your messaging, your constant, but fight boredom with the variables. Once you go quiet for too long, you lose the momentum of all that frequency you built up, so you have to start over again, which isn't the end of the world. It's just very annoying and inefficient. Lastly, marketing is an expensive business. You invest money and, most importantly, precious time. You cannot afford for it to miss its target, so you or whoever does your marketing needs to be accountable. With every project, there are things that fail or do not perform as well as expected. There are also things that work exceptionally well. Just post-mortem a big marketing moment the same way you post-mortem a big game project or a big milestone. Understand what works and what doesn't work, and apply this newfound knowledge to your next big marketing moment. Even small things can make a big difference. For example, recently we A/B tested a press release for a horror game set in a mansion called Perception. The place was referred to as the house or the mansion by developers interchangeably. In our minds, a house and a mansion were the same thing, so we tested both words in the subheader using MailChimp's A/B testing service. It turns out that the press release with mansion in the subheader had a significantly better response rate. It's just one word, but it gave people the idea that it was a bigger and more important game than when we used the word house. A valuable learning for the rest of the campaign. In our mind, it was the same thing, but in the mind of our audience, it was more like this. This brings us to the end of the presentation. I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Uppercut Games, Gamius and the Deep End Games for letting me use their games as an example. On IndieDevKit.com, we have a messaging wizard that will take you through this messaging process step by step. If you have any questions, please send them our way. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching.